Hello U.S. history students and welcome back. Today we are going to look in this video at the European theater of war in World War II after the attack at Pearl Harbor. So the United States of America has been slowly but surely preparing for this war, knowing that public opinion was very much opposed to a war before Pearl Harbor. However, President Roosevelt saw the writing on the wall. He'd also been in communication with Winston Churchill, the Bulldog Prime Minister over in England, and knew that if England fell, it would be a world-altering event in which there would be no one left in Europe to stand up to Hitler. Now, the Soviet Union is also fighting at this time, and so these two will end up being our key allies in World War II. But today we will look at the way in which the United States is going to prove Winston Churchill's quote correct, when after Pearl Harbor, Winston Churchill said that the rest of this war will be determined by the application of overwhelming power. And once the United States gets involved, we'll definitely prove that true. Before we get into the war effort that's taking place in the European theater of World War II, I'd like us to take a look at the situation facing Japanese American citizens after the attack at Pearl Harbor. Japanese American citizens are people that are either immigrants, legal immigrants into the United States, or they were born here and are therefore legally American citizens. Both are guaranteed certain civil liberties, and of course there are also Japanese citizens who are citizens of Japan but are just living in the United States temporarily on like work visas and that kind of thing. All of these people are going to become targets very quickly for the ire and hatred of Americans after Pearl Harbor. Part of the reason for that is because there were people living in Hawaii that were of Japanese descent, some of them citizens of the United States, but most of them were just people sent there by the government of Japan to spy on the Americans. Now, whether that was going to schools in America and California, that area, or going to Honolulu, Hawaii, specifically for the purpose of getting pictures of the ships and the targets that the Japanese military would use in their attack. Either way, there's certainly a rumor and a threat for the Americans that there are Japanese people inside the United States that are willing to spy on Americans, and which could bring about another Pearl Harbor type of attack. So for that reason, FDR and Congress are willing to infringe on civil liberties in order to try and prevent another attack. Now we can take that side of the story, which is the nicer side of the story, or we can look at the fact that this war is infringing on civil liberties in the way that wars often do, because these people were perceived as being a threat, even though by and large they were not. We call them internment camps. The Germans call their camps concentration camps, okay? I mean, really, it's a war of rhetoric here. You can call it whatever you want. Thankfully, we were not creating death camps. We did not have the same mentality that the Germans did of working people to death, enslaving them, or killing them in gas chambers. That is not at all what the United States was doing. I just want to make that clear. But at the same time, it's the same kind of idea. You're taking someone who's seen as an enemy within your country and removing them from their homes, taking their property, taking away their basic human rights and their civil liberties, and putting them in a camp where they're enclosed to be isolated from the rest of the country. 120,000 Japanese Americans are going to be given a notice, basically. They'll be told you have to pack everything you can into one suitcase per person. One suitcase per person. Your entire life has to fit into that suitcase. And some of these people were Issei, which are first-generation Japanese immigrants to the United States. They are legal citizens, but they were born in Japan and legally immigrated into the United States. Others are what you would call Nisei, or second-generation American citizens who are descendants of parents that are first-generation immigrants. And you can see how people in America are reacting to these Japanese American citizens. They're using racist terms like Jap, saying Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. Or Japs, don't let the sun set on you here. Keep moving. There were also signs that went up at this time. For instance, in California, there were barbershops that proclaimed free shaves for Japs. But then at the bottom of that advertisement, it said, not responsible for accidents. Okay, so the fact is that Americans are very upset after Pearl Harbor, with good reason, and are going to target innocent civilians for this fear. Now, FDR, of course, is going to be behind this as well, because he will issue what's called the Executive Order 9066. This is a controversial use of presidential power in our history because FDR claims, and I think he was sincere in many ways, but he claims that that the entire western seaboard is going to be seen as a war zone. And by declaring that a war zone, that basically meant that FDR could do what he wanted to do without asking for congressional approval. But Congress certainly would have approved this too. But what they did is they created war relocation camps. Now, these war relocation camps were set up in places like Tule Lake and very famous camps like that. But one that's near us here in Montana would be Hart Mountain. Hart Mountain is on the way to, as you're driving toward Denver or as you're driving toward Cody, it's kind of in between those routes. Dorothea Lange was a famous female photographer that worked for the New Deal that went and took famous pictures like this one. The vast majority of them are American citizens, and a third of them are under the age of 19 years old. They were fed enough, they worked, and they were treated, well enough, but the thing is that they were deprived of their basic civil liberties as American citizens. And they had their property taken, so that even after this war was over, if they went back home to their white man's neighborhood, their businesses, their homes, they'd been taken. They were gone. The governor of Idaho at this time said the best solution for the Jap problem is to send them all back to Japan, then sink the island. You keep that quote in mind as we get into a later video as we talk about the war against Japan, the firebombing of Japan, and in particular, the atomic bombing of Japan. But Admiral Yamamoto was correct when we saw in our last video that now the sleeping giant had awoken, and the first people to feel the effects of that are Japanese American citizens. So we'll focus more upon Europe today and then the Japanese theater of war in our next video. Hitler's empire is quite different from Japan's empire. You see, Hitler's empire spanned 244,000 kilometers. And you might notice from this map here, it's basically a giant chunk. And so the idea being that if we attack Hitler in strategic points, we'll slowly but surely condense in on Germany and bring about a total capitulation in this war. But that, of course, is easier said than done. Compare that to the Japanese empire. The Japanese empire is spread across thousands, literally thousands of different islands across the Pacific, and it spans 1.1 million kilometers. And it will be a very different kind of campaign that will take place to try and remove the Japanese threat. But as we take a look at the Axis versus Allies in Europe, we'll see the clash of titans. This sleeping giant truly will awake, and we can see that through some of the propaganda of the time period. I want you to notice the differences here in the propaganda and also the messages that are taking place. So the United States needs the citizens of the United States to not just pay for this war through taxes, but through an additional stimulus from citizens called war bonds. So war bond drives are going to take place. All kinds of propaganda is going to be out there about saving food, about saving steel, about saving aluminum, fuel, anything that could be used to help promote the American war effort and be used better. Here you can see an example with Adolf Hitler where it says, "Let's catch him with his panzers down." It's quite cheeky, really. It's meant to be kind of funny, but at the same time ridiculing Hitler. As I look at this, he looks not necessarily harmless, but he looks foolish, certainly looks foolish. And there's no racist intention behind this propaganda. It's just, let's make Hitler look like a Doomkopf. Whereas this is a bit different. So Japan, after attacking the United States at Pearl Harbor, is certainly going to be hated. Tokyo Kid was the propaganda character that was used to caricaturize Japanese people as these nasty villains. You can see here that they portray Tokyo Kid as a bat, and he's got this nasty, goofy, animalistic looking face with vampire teeth and bat ears, basically. And then down here you can see he's an ally of the Germans, but then we've also got a knife. Psychological studies have shown that it is far easier to kill a person with a gun because you're killing them from a distance. Whereas with a knife, it is something that is up close, it is personal, it is something where you feel that person dying as you are killing them with the knife. It's kind of a serial killer sort of tactic. Serial killers typically don't kill with guns because the death is too distant. They want to be close. And so this use of a knife is certainly a villainous kind of thing to make them look more villainous. If you look at this poster, it says Tokyo Kidsei, driving like sap, helping for Jap. And the term Jap, by the way, is a very racist term, and it was used to dehumanize the Japanese. And then you notice this poster has the same message. When you drive alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club, meaning preserve your fuel, meaning don't be an idiot that wastes fuel. But you notice there's no racist intention behind this poster. And as we're looking at these, you might be arguing, well, okay, well, Japan attacked us, and so therefore that's the reason that that people are so vitriolic or angry, hateful towards the Japanese. Now, while that is true, Germany also attacked us. After the declaration of war from Germany on December the 9th against the United States, they sent submarines, especially, to go and attack American shipping lines. So there were a bunch of submarines off the eastern coast, especially in New York City, that were attacking American ships, and particularly American oil tankers. They also went down to the Bayou region of New Orleans to attack along the Louisiana port and in the area of the Gulf of Mexico as well. So Germany attacked the United States as well on our home turf, but at the same time, not to the same extent. So what you get from this propaganda is certainly a sense, yeah, of racism, also of the anger that Americans are feeling towards the Japanese in particular. Here you can see again Tokyo Kid talking about the waste of material and how happy that makes the Japanese Tokyo Kid. It's a bit racist, though, isn't it? Just a bit. Okay, now you see this one's a bit different, too. This one is representing for the Americans the fear of another gas attack. At this time, after World War I, you remember gas had been outlawed as a use of warfare, but no one was really sure if anyone would follow that because, yes, it's criminal, but, you know, crimes happen in war. So many people were fearful that there would be a gas attack over major cities. In fact, cities like London were using special paint on their mailboxes that would turn color if there was gas in the air to indicate to people that they are being poisoned, because otherwise they may not be able to see that gas. So there's a lot of fear right now, but because of what later we will call in the nuclear era mutually assured destruction, it's the same kind of thing with gas. There's that mutual fear so bad so that many countries are going to decide not to use this against each other because they're fearful that it'll be a reprisal against them. Now, women are also going to see a lot of propaganda directed at them during this time. You can see a very famous lady here, Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter was based off of a model, an American model, and she actually just recently died at the time of the making of this video, and she was in her late 90s. And she is representing for women the idea of both strength and beauty, because they don't want to overly make women look masculine, right? Because that goes against the idea, making them look like dudes if they're joining the workforce. But at the same time, making them look powerful and strong and empowering these women to want to join the workforce to help, but at the same time making them look attractive and fetching. And this is the ultimate propaganda symbol that worked so well to create what you'd call a watershed moment in women's history, where this is kind of a dividing line between then and now, where women are joining the workforce and much will change in women's history in America because of World War II. You can see this poster, which says, "Women in the war, we can't win without them." Amen to that one. Am I right, ladies? Holla back. And then another group that was certainly disenfranchised before World War II are African Americans. African Americans throughout American history have always served in American wars. There's always been an African American regiment in our American wars that have taken place. And at the moment, still in World War II, unfortunately, the military had not yet been desegregated. There was still just too much racism and idiots out there. And so two very important African American units are going to form all black brigades with white officers, and they're called the Buffalo Soldiers and the Tuskegee Airmen. The Buffalo Soldiers take their name actually from the 19th century, because after the Civil War, you had groups like the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, where these soldiers, after fighting, pursued a career in the military, but they still had to be in an all-black unit. And so often those units were sent out to fight in the Indian Wars. So the Native American warriors dubbed African Americans with the nickname Buffalo Soldiers because they felt their hair and said that it was springy and the color of a buffalo's hair. And therefore the name stuck. And so the Buffalo Soldiers will be a part of the land regiments that will take place in the army and will be key to the victory in Italy during World War II. And then the Tuskegee Airmen are going to be this incredible group of World War II fighter plane pilots who were trained in Tuskegee, Alabama, at the same location where the Tuskegee Institute had been formed by Booker T. Washington to help train African Americans in trades back in the 19th century. And so now these men get their chance to prove themselves. They will primarily serve in the latter part of the war as guides and protectors of bombers that are going over Europe and those campaigns, but an incredible contribution to this war because we see from African Americans during this war what you'd call the double V for victory. So it's victory in Europe and then also victory over in America for civil rights. Another group that was very disenfranchised in American history and had only just recently achieved citizenship. Back in 1922, I believe it was, Native Americans finally achieved citizenship because of their participation in World War I. They're going to be a key contribution to World War II because they will be the largest per capita group of minorities that will participate in the war effort in World War II, whether it be in factories or in the war itself. The reason for that is because culturally, Native Americans, if they wanted to be a tribal leader, especially a tribal chief, they had to count coup, which meant that they were close enough to touch their enemies in battle or actually touching their enemies in battle. And not many battles going on for Native Americans to become warriors before this time. And so World War II gives them an ample opportunity. So many of them are going to serve as what were called the Navajo wind talkers. So the Germans had created and perfected this system of secretly carrying messages and transmitting messages over radio called the Enigma machine. Now there's a great movie about how the Brits at Bletchley Park were using a number of mathematicians and puzzle makers and game masters to figure out how to crack the code of the Enigma, and they did it by inventing the first supercomputer. Now over in the United States, the Navajo wind talkers are kind of our version of the Bletchley Park covert code making that was taking place for Great Britain. But the code talkers, when they were in the field of battle, would take the American coded language and then create an unbreakable code in Navajo off of that. So it's like a double code that proved unbreakable for both the Japanese and the Germans, which is amazing for us and helped us win the war effort because of the fact that we were able to crack the Japanese code within just a few short months of the war getting started, thanks to Navajo wind talkers. They're going to be able to figure out the location of Admiral Yamamoto's plane as he's flying over the Pacific. He, of course, is the one that planned the Pearl Harbor attack, and he is the one that also gives us the quote that he fears that Japan is waking a sleeping giant. And the Navajo wind talkers are the ones that located where he would be going, and we were able to shoot his plane out of the sky and kill him as a result. But then another thing, too, that's interesting is the Navajo wind talkers' coded language will not be broken. And they still continued to use this coded language they created until Vietnam and even in the first invasion of Iraq in 1991, still using it. It still forms the basis of much of the coded language in the American military. So as these titans come together to clash with Germany, we're going to focus on Germany first. So part of the reason that we're focusing upon Germany first in this thing, the Allies are a bit divided on how to take this thing on. I mean, first of all, Russia is totally bogged down in Europe fighting against Germany and is not yet committed to fighting a war against Japan. And that will be very important when we get to the end of the war. I'll just foreshadow that right now. Very important, the fact that Soviet Union, not at war with Japan right now. The United States and Britain are, but Britain does not really have the troops to be able to contribute to a war against Japan. So the United States is primarily taking on this task of fighting against the Axis powers in the Empire of Japan. But primarily, we are going to combine together to focus on Germany first for a few different reasons. First of all, because of the fact that the Nazis pose a much greater threat to the Western Hemisphere. All right, Japan is certainly an issue, but the Nazis, they've got the technology, they've got the science, they've got the weaponry and the army to be able to take out Great Britain. So without a foothold in Great Britain and Northern Africa, there's no way that the United States is going to be able to pursue a war successfully against the Nazis. Another problem, too, is that the German war potential is far more devastating. You can see some of the things that they've been working on lately, like the V2 rocket is a rocket technology that the Germans have been using, which would have dramatically change the course of the war had they been able to use it on a massive scale and effectively. You see, the V2 could fire from France, for instance. The German regiments in France could fire a V2 that would actually hit England. It wasn't very accurate, but at the same time, it had the potential to do that. So it's just a matter of determining how to make it more accurate at this point. Now, that would dramatically change things because the Brits and the Germans in their battle for Britain, the Germans are going to lose 3,000 pilots and suffer tremendous casualties to their Luftwaffe as they have to fly over enemy territory. And if you had a rocket, that would reduce the amount of losses that you could sustain as if you're firing that. Another thing too is that planes would be made so much more faster if they could use rocket propulsion. Every country in this war is working right now on no longer using the prop planes that have the spinny things in the front, but instead rocket propulsion, which could double the speed of a plane and make them impossible to hit with anti-aircraft guns. Another thing too is that the Germans are working on submarine technology that have rocket propulsion from the hull of their ship that would fire out of water and decimate the enemies. So what the Allies start to do is they begin to meet as early as 1941 and 42. So in the picture you can see here one of those famous meetings. This won't take place until February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference. Churchill is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Now the thing is that FDR does not trust Churchill because of the fact that he is a drinker, and I mean, he's rapidly seen with alcohol, and there was actually an American ambassador by the name of Joseph Kennedy. That's right, John F. Kennedy's dad. Joseph Kennedy was in England reporting back to America on Churchill, saying that he's a drunk, that he's belligerent, and that you can't trust the man. So there's a little bit of distrust right there. And then you've got Stalin, who doesn't trust Winston Churchill, because for the last 30 years, Winston Churchill has been talking about the need to destroy the Soviet Union and the need to destroy Bolshevism over in Eastern Europe. And so they don't trust each other. Churchill, meanwhile, does not trust FDR because FDR is an elected official. And so he has to run for re-election. And remember that FDR has just started his third term. He's going to have to run again for his fourth term. And so there's a lot of mistrust about an elected official who might not win election, and that could change the war effort or change the American enthusiasm for the war. Plus, when you lose a lot of men's lives, that looks bad when you're trying to run for re-election. And then meanwhile, Stalin. Nobody trusts Stalin, and with good reason. This is the guy that's responsible for the Red Terror and all kinds of problems against his own countrymen, killing as many as perhaps 5 to 8 million of his own people. But they will agree to work together because war makes interesting bedfellows, and so they will agree to work temporarily together. But in the Atlantic Charter, when Churchill and FDR are first able to meet, they're going to get together and talk in January of 1942 about the need to end all wars. So because of the failure of the League of Nations in World War I and the failure of the Treaty of Versailles to end these terrible wars, really we've seen a 20-year truce, a 20-year armistice, and then war reignited and on a much larger scale. So these guys are saying we need to prevent the next wars. First of all, by forming a United Nations group that's going to come together to prevent future warfare. But also, there's an intriguing part in this thing where they say in the Atlantic Charter that this war is being fought to end totalitarianism. And then they sent this to Joe Stalin, who's a totalitarian dictator, and they're saying, hey, Joe, just so you know, this is why we're fighting. And Joe Stalin's going to be like, totally, all about it. Let's do this thing. All right, because Joe Stalin needs some help at this point. All right, the war that's being fought in Europe is being fought by the Russians. I don't want to downplay the significance of the numbers of American lives or British lives that are lost in this war. I mean, the United States is going to lose about 350,000 American lives over the course of World War II. But the Russians have got us beat in terms of the numbers. They're going to lose 21 million people over the course of World War II. That's because of the scorched earth method. That's because of the Holocaust that takes place and the pogroms that will take place throughout Russia. That's because the Russian army is incredibly undersupplied, where you've got one man carrying the rifle and the other man carrying the extra ammunition. And when one gets shot, the other one takes the stuff. All right, they're an army that is definitely suffering right now. So the United States is slowly going to start working toward a second front in Europe, because right now it's primarily the Russians. And Stalin is saying, you guys got to get in here now to help us out, because otherwise we're going to lose to Hitler. So what they'll decide is a strategic bombing campaign is the best way to begin this thing. At this time, the bombs were loaded into B-17 planes, and the B-17 flying super fortress was this amazing work of technology for war. However, at the same time, it's a fuselage that is not pressurized, so that means that you're in an open air cabin, and so you need oxygen to help you breathe while you're up there. You've got machine gun turrets all over to try and protect this thing against planes that would come at you. And then what you do is you've got what's called the Nordland bomb sight. The Nordland bomb sight enables you to have an early version of a computerized bombing technique to see your target, but at the same time, it's not altogether accurate. I mean, you think about it, if you've got a plane that's flying overhead and you drop a bomb, both things are going to keep moving. And so this Nordland bomb sight helps to plot the trajectory of where that will eventually fall. So can they keep it that strategic? Not really. I mean, really what happens is there's all of this anti-aircraft fire and all of these planes that attack our planes as they're going across over into enemy territory, that we sustain tremendous losses. Roughly 1 out of every 3 missions that take place, or 1 out of every 3 planes that go across over to Germany in a bombing campaign get shot down. And then you lose a crew of 10 to 15 men in that process. And this is something that is incredibly devastating to our war effort. So in an effort to protect our planes, this strategic bombing becomes what we would call carpet bombing, where you're less concerned with the strategic aspect and more concerned with just hitting anything possible. And much of this is going to be taking place at night as well, because this allows pilots to have a little greater safety as they are flying over enemy territory. But it makes them even less effective with targeting only military or industrial targets. So therefore, civilians become the target of this thing as well. Now, the Germans are going to be very upset about this for a number of reasons, but to be fair, the Germans started this carpet bombing in the Battle for Britain and intentionally bombed civilian targets. And the B-17 Flying Fortress is the reason that we are able to do this. So what does this mean for the civilians that are on the ground? Well, as the United States and Britain are dropping their payloads over cities like Dresden, Dresden is going to see over the course of a few days 3,900 tons of incendiary bombs dropped upon their population. Incendiary means they intentionally are catching on fire and creating a massive firestorm. These explosives and these incendiaries will combine to kill 25,000 people over the course of 1 week of dropping bombs on Dresden. But then if you take a look at Operation Gomorrah, aptly named here, because in the firebombing of Hamburg, it was meant to take out the oil reserves that were near the city, but what they did was they end up hitting not only the oil, but also the city itself, and it created a 1,500-foot tornado of fire. This fire tornado swept through the city and killed nearly 43,000 citizens, and another 37,000 citizens were wounded over the course of this week of firebombing. Many people would try to hide in fallout shelters, and they're just going to be cooked and burned alive. This came as a huge shock to German citizens, because until this point in the war, German propaganda from the Nazi Party had basically made it seem like the war would never come to Germany, and that this would never affect German citizens themselves. But for the first time, the German citizens are made to realize not only the loss of their loved ones on the battlefront who are serving in the army, but now facing the terror of war coming directly to them by bombing and burning their cities. Some of those citizens later are going to claim that this was a war crime committed against Germany by the Allies, and then the Allies just have to say, Auschwitz. And that shuts them up pretty quick. The next attack is going to happen in northern Africa. Now you might wonder, why northern Africa? Well, down in northern Africa at this time there was a German general by the name of Erwin Rommel, whom they nicknamed the Desert Fox. Now I gotta say, I really do like Erwin Rommel. I know he's fighting for the wrong team here, but he's a hardcore man, a brilliant strategist as well. He fought in World War I as a stormtrooper. And now here he is just fighting for the wrong side in this war. And in fact, later he's going to be implicated in the assassination plot against Hitler and dubbed Operation Valkyrie. And even though he had very little, if anything, to do with it, the German Gestapo are going to come to his home and threaten that they will kill his family unless he goes with them. And he says, fine, wait a minute. He goes and puts on his uniform. He kisses his wife and kids goodbye. He goes and gets in the car. And then he goes off and faces his death against the German Gestapo. I mean, this guy is still celebrated as a hero in Germany because of his stance against Hitler. But the man, myth, and legend that's going to be going up against him here for the Americans in Northern Africa is General George S. Patton. The man is a World War I hero, and he's super hardcore. I gotta love the guy. All right, George S. Patton is one of the greatest military figures in American history. He's full of all kinds of great quotes, too. For instance, he says, "Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and the man who leads that gains that victory." Amen to that, George S. Patton. He also says a pint of sweat will save a gallon of blood. Oh yeah, gotta love that one. And then finally, some goddamn fool once said that flanks have got to be secure. Since then, sons of bitches all over the globe have been guarding their flanks. I don't agree with that. My flanks are something for the army to worry about, not me. Before he finds out where my flanks are, I'll be cutting that bitch's throat. Oh, you gotta love the guy, right? You heard that he cussed a lot. He was definitely the kind of guy that his men loved because he cussed a lot, because he was a great leader, because he fought so hard. The man would go into battle carrying a Colt 45 pistol with an ivory grip on it, and even though it made no difference to this thing, he would be riding on a tank and he'd be like shooting his gun wildly at Germans as they ran away or as their tanks were driving around. That gun would not hit anything, but he would do it just to be in that battle, just in the moment. You gotta love the guy, right? Another thing too is he was a West Point graduate, but he didn't do really well in terms of grades, and so there's a beautiful statue of General George S. Patton outside the library today at West Point, and the statue is facing away from the library. The reason being because Patton said he never spent a single day of his college career in the library. What a guy. Now, there's one more great story about General Patton that I'd like to share with you, and it involves toward the end of the war. So if we fast forward a couple years here to 1945, as the United States is about to cross the Rhine River, the U.S. tanks and the infantry are about to go over this bridge that will connect with the Rhine River, and they're getting ready to make their final assault into Germany itself. And Eisenhower is telling the men, Eisenhower is future president, he's also the leader of Allied forces in Europe, he's telling the men, get into Germany, get in there as soon as you can. But General Patton sent an order to all of the men and said, no, you do not cross the Rhine without me being at the front of that column. I get to be there first. And Eisenhower was very upset about this, of course, because this guy was overruling him. But Patton gets there first because he insists he wants to be the first man in the U.S. Army to piss in the Rhine. You can see the famous picture. He said, as he's peeing into the Rhine River, he insisted that a photographer come over and take his photo. And you can just see him looking at the camera with all pure joy as his tank piece is hanging out there pissing into the Rhine. What a story, right? What a guy. So as Rommel retreats out of Tunisia and into Italy, the Allied forces are going to invade into Sicily in what was called Operation Husky. This was an amphibious and airborne attack intended to open the sea lanes and drive the Axis out of the sky. Now, the Allied forces sustained 22,000 casualties, and this was against Italian regiments. And no offense to the Italian regiments, but they're not like Hitler's regiments, okay? They're not nearly as well equipped or talented at war. So this is a sign to planners that if we're going to invade Europe, we're going to see heavy casualties. And Mussolini will end up being toppled from power at this point, but the Nazis will rescue him and reinstate him to power, meanwhile occupying the rest of northern Italy with elite soldiers and the creation of the Salo Republic, and continue to resist all the way until April of 1945. Meanwhile, over in the east, we're going to see where the turning point will take place at the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad means Stalin City. And at the Battle of Stalingrad, that will take place between August of 1942 and February of 1943, the Russians will sustain over 841,000 casualties, and the Germans over 1.2 million casualties. This is the bloodiest single battle in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad is a terrible affair that will actually end up turning the course of war, though, because the German back will be broken in many ways there, and at that point they start to slowly but surely fall back. So with these attacks into the soft underbelly of the Axis, as it was called, into Italy, and then also the war front that's taking place over in the east with the Russians, and the tremendous amount of casualties sustained in these war efforts prove to us, is that in the event that we do go into Northern Europe across what is called Hitler's Atlantic Wall in France, the United States and its allies will sustain heavy casualties. This is a war that is going to end up being fought inch by inch and yard by yard. And we'll look at part 2 of the European theater of war in our next video. Thanks for watching.